This is part 4, the last video in this Fabric.js tutorial series. And we will start by going over object animations. Then we will deal with a simple example of an object event listener. We will learn about object caching and when we might want to disable this or manually mark the cache as dirty. We will learn about grouping and ungrouping objects in the canvas, which is very helpful for allowing the user to control multiple objects at once. Then we will learn how to store and restore the state of the canvas, and we can do this in both the SVG and JSON format. Lastly, we will learn how to upload our own image into the canvas. So let's talk about animations. This is the rectangle class again, and let's look for animate. We see this function here, animate property value. Seems pretty straightforward. We specify a property and a value and it animates it. But what we're lacking here is a lot of other details. How do we specify the duration, the type of animation being used, etc. This is one situation where I highly recommend looking at the tutorial. So here's the tutorial. It's actually quite short. I'll just briefly talk about what this animate function does and its parameters. Animate is pretty straightforward, so don't stress out about it. The first thing we notice here is we have the property from earlier, the value, and this third parameter we didn't see, and it's this onChange value. What we have here is an object which we can specify different properties that relate to this animate function. The onChange essentially is the function that is called between the frames of animation. So what happens when you animate this rectangle? For example, say this rectangle is at 0 degrees. When we say animate to 45 degrees, there are going to be many update steps to that rectangle so it appears that it's moving to 45 degrees. So maybe they move to 0.5, 1, 1.5, all the way up to 45 degrees. In order for those changes to appear on our canvas, we have to call render all, which is pretty much what they're doing here. And they're just binding the context of the canvas is this to this render all function. And generally this is something that you just include with all your animate functions. So moving on, there is a way for us to, instead of specifying the concrete value that we're going to go to, we can specify a offset. The left value of the rectangle is at 50, the result would be 150 and it will do this animation. Let's look at the other properties that can be specified on this object. We scroll down here, we see from, duration, on complete easing. From is just another way we can specify the current value. So imagine the rectangle is by default at 0 degrees, but you want it to start at 15 degrees. You can tell the animation to start from 15 degrees. Duration is just the duration in milliseconds. OnComplete is just a callback function that can be called. You can use it to chain animations or do whatever you want afterwards. And easing allows you to specify how you want your animation to be displayed. Fabric.util.ease will have different ways for you to specify different animations. And an example will be Fabric.util ease out bounce. And let's try putting it into action. But I think it'll be a neat feature to have the objects drop down to the center of the canvas. And we can accomplish this with the animate we just learned about. So if we look at recAnimate, we can just call this function right after we create our rectangle. I do not need to change the left value since my x coordinate is going to be consistent. What I want to change is the y coordinate, which is the top value. And in our case, if we want the rectangle to start outside of the canvas, we could set it to some negative number, such as the negative size of the radius, since we are positioning around the center of origin x and y. I'll just do that right here. But we can also do this with the from property. Let's try this out. But let's do something different for the circle. Right now we're just using one animation. What would be cool is if the circle could fall down and bounce back up to the center. And we can accomplish this using the callback. So you could pause and attempt this yourself, or you can just follow along. Now this first step will be similar to what we did with the rectangle, but now the ball will be going all the way down to the bottom of the canvas. And we must remember that we're using origin X and Y center so we can compute this distance correctly. I'm starting top from -50 as well. The ending position will be the height of the canvas, subtracting the radius. Now let's just try out this first step of the animation. So cool, it lands down properly. We know we can specify a callback. I'm just going to add this on complete property. Let's add another circle animation once this first animation is completed. We want this circle to end up back in the center. In this situation, now we can just specify camCenter.top. One thing I want to change is the speed in which it bounces up. Right now when it bounces down, it looks like it's sticking to the bottom and jumping back up very slowly. So let's go look at the easing function. Here we are in the Fabric util ease namespace, and let's look what we have available to us. Ease out bounce seems interesting. I'm going to try that one out. I settled on lowering the duration of the inner animation and using the ease out bounce for the easing. So that concludes the basics of how to animate objects. Let's react to some events on our objects. When we add a rectangle and a circle to the canvas, nothing happens when we select and deselect it. Looking at the Fabric object class, we can see there are many events we can react to. And I want to react to event selected and event deselected. I want to change the color of the rectangle when it is selected and deselected. When it is deselected, I want to restore the color. Let's try this out and see if it works. Selecting and deselecting the rectangle and circle don't seem to be doing anything. Let's just confirm that these functions are being called. This code inside the selected and deselected seem to be running. What's happening? So Canvas caches your object. This is their way to optimize and allow objects to be quickly redrawn onto the canvas, even when you are moving your rectangle, scaling your rectangle, etc. If you see here, the cache for the rectangle was finally seen as stale and replaced. One easy fix for this issue that we are seeing is to disable caching on the object. There's a property called object caching, which is a boolean. So we can simply set it to false and see if that solves our issue. This solves our issue. Now we can do something similar for the circle. both our rectangle and circle react to the selected and deselected events. Some of you may be wondering, what if we want the benefits of caching, but still have our rectangle change color whether or not it is selected or deselected? Previously, I believed that setting a property directly, such as with an equal sign, is equivalent to saying rect.set fill white. And that's where I was wrong. Rect.set has some other benefits, one of which is checking whether or not object caching should be marked as dirty. I'm just going to go ahead and replace all of my equal statements with rect.set. Now we're going to learn about grouping objects. It would be nice if we could control several or even all the objects in the canvas at once, giving us the option to move them, scale them, rotate them. While we could do this manually by listening to the different events like scale, rotate, move, and updating the elements that we would like to be linked together, similar functionality can be achieved far easier if we use groups. I'll start by adding 2 more buttons to our objects div. I'll add a group button and an ungroup button. So I'm going to create a function called groupObjects. And for parameters, I will pass in the canvas again. I also want to keep track of the state of the group object that I create so I can easily ungroup it later. And lastly, pass in a boolean that will tell us whether or not we should group it. And I'll simply center these buttons. Now let's make our groupObjects function. So we're taking in the canvas, group, and a boolean as we said earlier. We should distinguish whether or not we are grouping the objects or ungrouping them. We want to keep track of the group object so we can easily ungroup it. I'll add a variable here. In this case, I am going to make this an object. The reason for this is because when we pass in this group variable and leave it undefined, the function will create a copy of it and we won't have a reference to it later. If you remember from earlier, we have the getObjects function. It returns us an array of the children objects inside the canvas. We can use the return value of this function in conjunction with the constructor for the group class. The group class is initialized through a group of objects, and this group of objects is exactly what we're returned from the canvas class using the getObjects function. Let's try combining both of those. These objects are already in the canvas right now. What we want to do is turn these objects into a group, remove them from the canvas, and add the group into the canvas. Here I'm setting the val property of the group object to the new group that we're creating. I can add this group to the canvas, but if we do this, we still have the objects in the canvas. So what we have to do is remove the objects before we add the group to the canvas. Since we already made a clear canvas function earlier, we can just call the function that we made and it can handle clearing the canvas for us. Previously, I was using this render all syntax, and while this works, I actually recommend to use request render all. It was introduced in Fabric.js version 2, and essentially they pretty much function very similarly. I believe one of the main differences is optimization, where request render all won't make another request if there is a request pending or a request in progress. Okay, so we have our object for grouping the things in the canvas. So we can try this part out first. Looks like the group is working. And again, we have this dim border, and this can easily be set just like before. Cool, now let's try ungrouping these objects. We could make this const, since we're not actually changing this object itself. When we group these items and then ungroup them, we want these items to be separate again, where we can control them freely. One way we can achieve this is by removing this group from the canvas and adding back in these objects. First, we want to keep track of the objects inside this group. There is a getObjects function, and it's very similar to the canvas's getObjects function, where it returns us the array of children objects. We'll be calling this without the optional parameter. Now we want to remove this group from the canvas. Because this gives us the objects in the group, now we want to remove this group from the canvas. And we must use group.val. After removing this group from the canvas, let's add the items back in. Old group gives us an array of the objects, so let's use the spread operator. And just to keep it clean, I want to reset this group variable since it's no longer represented in our canvas. There seems to be an issue with our ungroup at this point. If we add our objects into the canvas, group them, ungroup them, and then we press group again, the objects aren't properly restored to their previous state. The Fabric group class has a destroy function that destroys a group and restores the state of its objects. So when we get these objects directly, their state is not properly saved. Let's try calling destroy before we get these objects. This seems to work perfectly. So right now when we add objects into the canvas and press clear, these objects are lost forever. Fabric.js provides ways for us to restore the state of a canvas. There's toJSON, which gives us a JSON representation of the canvas, toObject, and lastly toSVG. With toJSON and toObject, we can later on call load from JSON, and this takes in a string or an object, which allows us to restore these objects back into the canvas. Why would you even use SVGs? There's a huge benefit with this SVG format, which allows us to use this SVG in other applications that can understand the SVG format. Let's just try out the basic SVG version. I feel that if you can do the SVG version, you can easily do the JSON or object format. Let's just start by adding a restore button. I'm going to make another method called restore canvas. I also want the SVG I'm restoring to be passed in as a parameter. And this needs to be defined in your JavaScript file as well. I'm making it into an object just for the same reason we're making the group into an object. Now let's define the restore canvas. So before the canvas is cleared, let's call toSVG. Another thing that I want to pass into my clear canvas function is the SVG state as well. And I'll assign state.val equal to this canvas SVG. Let's try restoring the canvas now. If the state val exists, we can restore this SVG into the canvas. In the Fabric namespace, there's a method called load SVG from string. It has two optional parameters, which we'll be skipping for now. But there's string and callback, which allows us to specify the SVG string and specify a callback for us to add in the resulting objects into the canvas. Although we are assuming that the canvas is cleared and we press restore after, this background image is still part of the canvas, and later on when we restore it, we would be adding it on top of itself, which is not what is desired. We can call the load SVG from string method. So the callback returns us the canvas objects in an array, so we can just add these objects back into the canvas as we've been doing previously. The first thing I noticed is that this is not functioning how I would like it. The background image is selectable and the other objects go behind it once it's selected. Instead of calling clear on the canvas, I can call the clear canvas that we defined, and I can filter this array to ignore that image. So I'm just going to make the background URL into its own variable. And I'm going to have it be passed into the restore canvas. It takes this array and it filters this array to make sure each of the array elements satisfy this condition. And it returns this filtered array. This is a mistake on my part. This should be not equal. And we probably don't need to clear the canvas since we restore after we clear it. We're successfully saving the state of this canvas into an SVG and restoring it back to the canvas. The last thing that I think would be neat to have is the option to upload an image. I'll start by adding another div next to this objects div. Okay, so in terms of styling, I'll just briefly show you what I did, as it's totally up to you. I started out by generalizing some of the classes that I used before. So now it's a generic buttons wrapper, buttons title, and a buttons class. This bottom buttons div will just contain other button wrappers. I did some small updates to the style of things, and you could just refer here. Now we can move on to adding the input button. Type will be file, and let's accept only images. So you want to make sure to give this a unique ID. I will call this my image. Now I can access this ID through the JavaScript code. And I can add an event listener to this element. So I'll define this image added function up here. Looking up the HTML input element, you can see the different supported properties, and files is one of them. So good, so we got our first element, and it's of type file. So we can access the first element in our files array, and that will give us our desired file. Now that we have this file, we want to convert it to a URL. So first we can just define a reader. I'll define it above our function calls. Now we can go back to our function and use this reader. There is a function called readAsDataURL where we can pass in a specified blob or file. And in the end, the reader we define will contain the URL in its result attribute. So we want to read this file. And we want to make sure to listen to the event. So I will actually define this reader event listener down at the bottom because this is something we only need to define once. Reader.result should contain what we're looking for. And just to show you that we can use this, we can click on this. And the image will be displayed in the browser. Now let's take this URL and combine it with the FromURL method in our Fabric Canvas class. My mistake, FromURL is a image method. And cool, our image is added to the canvas and we can resize, move, etc. And of course, there are additional properties to this image we can modify, but as an example for adding an image into the canvas, this does the job. There are some modifications we need to make to our groupObjects function. Firstly, we modified clear canvas so it has to take in a second parameter. But in our case, we're not using SVG state for anything, and it is harmless putting it here. Then we have to make sure we're calling clear canvas here, we're adding back in the old group after we clear it, and we request to render all. This concludes my Fabric.js tutorial series. My goal with these videos is to help others while solidifying my own knowledge and I genuinely appreciate any tips on how I can improve. I plan to upload future technology and coding videos. If those interest you, feel free to subscribe, and good luck on your journey.